Some years ago, a Catholic priest I knew asked me about Armenians. Where did they come from? Who were they? And indeed, where was Armenia? I was very surprised. We talked about Noah's Ark and the Garden of Eden, as mentioned in the Bible. And I explained that this was where Armenia was, a part of eastern Anatolia. But I'm unsure why he looked uninterested in what I was talking about. When considering some colorful aspects of the world's history, studies show that Armenians originally arrived at the Armenian Plateau during the 800s BC. However, one asks, where did they really originate from? Were they the offspring of Sumerians, for their stories and folklore have similarities with Sumerians of old? Studies show it to be the reality, and this is also why a brief observation of their history becomes an excellent idea, for they played a major role in humanity's past. Here is an encyclopedic story of Armenians, where we discover that Persian and Greek empires have ruled the country for periods of time. They gained complete independence in 189 BC. The great ruler Dikran II came to power during 95 BC and built the Armenian Empire, which extended from the Mediterranean to the Caspian Sea. The Romans defeated him in 55 BC and are said to have ruled Armenia at various periods until the 1400s AD. During this time, a number of nations, including Arabs, Turks, Mongols, and Persians, battled with the Romans to gain control of Armenia. In fact, Armenia was the very first nation to accept Christianity during the 300s AD. They defended their religious identity in the Battle of Awaria in 451 against the Persians. The Armenian alphabet was invented during the 400s, and they translated the Bible, establishing their first university. During the Byzantine rule of the Roman Empire, Armenians held significant and very powerful positions in the military, even within the whole of the European continent. When the Ottomans gained control of Armenia, many were slaughtered due to their religious identity. Most of Armenia was under the cruel rulership of the Ottoman Empire until their defeat during World War I, 1914 to 1918. Starting with the year 1894, the Ottomans began a movement to completely eradicate Armenians. This campaign was at its peak during World War I. During this time, 1,800,000 or more were slaughtered, and thousands more fled to other countries. However, during 1918, the remaining Armenians defeated the Turkish invading army and established an independent state. During 1920, the Treaty of Sivas was signed by Turkey and the Allies. This way, an independent Armenia included most of the historical land. However, Russia, together with Turkey, invaded Armenia later that same year. The Russians took over eastern Armenia in November 1920 and made it a Soviet republic. Russian Armenia joined the republics of Georgia and Azerbaijan in the Transcaucasian Federation in 1922. These three republics were separated later in 1956. During that year, Armenia became the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. The Soviet government assisted them with their industrialization. More than 200,000 Armenians are believed to have returned from other countries since then. Many Armenians have gained power and fame, not only in Russia, but all around the world. To name a few, think about the great composer Aram Khachaturian. And Anastas Mikoyan became president of Russia in 1964 and 1965. Previously, he had served as the very first vice president of the country. He was also the Commissioner of Food Supply and Minister of Trade. He visited the United States in 1936 for the first time and became supply chief of the Russian army during World War II. He was born in Russian Armenia and was the son of a carpenter. He studied theology, but became a communist in 1915 and took part in the Russian Civil War of 1918 to 1920. He was also a member of the party's Central Committee from 1922 to 1976, as well as a member of its Politburo from 1926 to 1966. Russian-designed jet fighter planes were named as MiG. The most advanced type was MiG-21J and was able to fly at supersonic speeds at sea level. Its designers were the Russian-Armenian Artem Mikoyan and Mikhail Gurevich in 1900s. Do you remember magical voice of Charles Aznavour? In reality, his family name would end with Jan or Ian. Think about Karajan, the name of the famous conductor, for I have often been questioned about the meaning of his name. Actually, almost all Armenian names end with Jan, Yan, or Ian. The word alone stands for the son of, which is similar to some European names like Stevenson or Johnson. It still surprises me how some scholarly people can be unbelievably ignorant about the facts of history. Then again, it should not be a real concern in the face of falsified documents of old and denials of the actual reality of past events due to the religious control system of nations. One wonders about how much of man's history has been faithfully recorded, let alone correctly presented on an as-is basis. In my case, like my brother, I too was ardently encouraged never to question our past or even search for information. Interestingly, when in Turkey, we were expected to learn about the past in a biased way at school, emphasizing the Ottomans' history and their great achievements when they invaded other countries. We were also encouraged to think of those invasions as the only truthful records of history. This is when the invading armies apparently introduced good hygiene and healthy practices, making, for example, entire European nations painted as completely uncivilized. In Europe, however, the schooling we were subjected to taught us a different kind of history, showing us who the real uncivilized barbarians were, who were right and what, indeed, was the correct presentation of history. Why could we not learn all about the true reality of things? At this point, I feel the need to share with you some historic viewpoints as research and study indicates using available data I was familiar from, archival literature when referring to facts, and my own theories in regard to my parental background. We have been told that the past was unimportant, yet we were subjected to history lessons at school. Was this due to having every detail of minority groups not adhering to the religious principles of their nation, not deserving to live as human beings, and their citizens being wiped off as if they never existed, unless they changed their identity, names, and religious beliefs? Although Armenians contributed much to their culture as a minority group, they were targeted, segregated, and literally destroyed as rebels, allegedly presenting a great danger to their government's stability. Similar attitudes can be observed all around the world, under the fanatical dictums of uneducated religious leaders. We were not surprised to find that there was non-existent documentation proving that we ever existed. We were also not surprised to find only fragmented and doctored documents showing that we ever had a background. My parents did not enlighten us, even about our relations scattered around the world, and that could not have been due to my brother and me being incapable of comprehending the intricacies of life, although some people of no significance conveniently prefer to think of us as lacking in intelligence. But let me take you to a different page in history, for I believe it is relevant to my parents' background. I will try to make it as colorful as possible. The earliest inhabitants of the landmass now known as Turkey were the Hittites. Many were said to have migrated from Central Asia and parts of Europe into Central Anatolia in approximately 2000 BC. During the following few years, they conquered most of Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Syria, and during 1500 BC, they created a great empire. However, large parts of Anatolia fell to the Lydians, Phrygians, and a few others from circa 1200 to 500 BC. During this period, the Greeks established several cities along Anatolia's Aegean coast. The Persians seized control of Anatolia and Thrace during 500 BC, but Macedonian Alexander the Great crushed the Persian army in 331 BC. As you can imagine, after Alexander's death in 323 BC, Anatolia became a battleground among his successors. Small rulerships rose to power and fell until 63 BC, the time when the Roman general Pompey conquered the region. Anatolia was finally at peace under Roman rule for about 400 years. The Roman Emperor Constantine the Great relocated his capital from Rome to the ancient city of Byzantium in Thrace, and renamed it Constantinople, the city of Constantine. During 395, the empire was divided into East and West Roman empires. Barbarians conquered the West Roman Empire in the mid-400s. The East Roman Empire was known as the Byzantine Empire, and Byzantine emperors ruled the region until the late 1000s. The Muslim Seljuks from south-central Russia and northern Mongolia invaded the country and were known to be one of the first Turkish peoples therein. They conquered Armenia, the Holy Land, and Iran. In 1071, they destroyed the Byzantine rule in Anatolia when they defeated the Byzantine army in Manzikert. They then set up an empire with Iconium as their capital. This city is now known as Konya. From then on, the Christian religion and Greek language were gradually replaced by Islam, and a form of Turkish language was introduced. The history enacted around this part of the world has been rich with controversy, battlements, and much bloodshed, as well as being a part of biblical stories. Thankfully, more down-to-earth information in regard to the facts thereof is still available in ancient records. Thorough research into the evidence proving the reality of things is like time travel into bygone days, and is a worthy consideration when examining the ever-present differences between Turks and Armenians without bias. However, let us consider a few more historic facts, remembering that in 1095, Christians in Western Europe started a campaign setting up military expeditions they called crusades to drive the invaders from the Holy Land. The first crusade was during 1096 to 1099. They defeated the Seljuk Turks severely in western Anatolia, but subsequently left the peninsula to fight in the Holy Land. The Seljuk Empire lasted until 1243, when it was invaded by the Asian Mongols. However, the Mongol Empire experienced extreme internal struggles and finally fell apart, thus helping the Turks to expand into Anatolia. During the 1300s, a group of them, calling themselves the Ottomans, started to build a different empire. In 1326, they seized the city of Bursa and made it their capital. Whilst all this was happening, they conquered two-thirds of western Anatolia and most of Thrace, as well as large parts of the Balkan Peninsula and Greece. The only small part of Byzantine Empire which remained was in the area around Constantinople. In 1453, Muhammad II captured Constantinople and ended the Byzantine rule. This city was later named by the Turks as Istanbul and became their capital. In 1481, their empire stretched from the river Danube to southern Anatolia. In the 1500s, they reached their height. During the reign of Sultan Bayezid II, from 1481 to 1512, the empire became a naval leader in the Mediterranean region. They conquered Syria in 1516 and Egypt in 1517. Suleiman I, known as Magnificent throughout Europe, became their supreme ruler from 1520 to 1566. His army conquered much of Hungary during 1526 in the Battle of Mohacs, and he expanded his empire to Yemen in the south, Morocco in the west, and Persia in the east. The Ottomans were extremely cruel to everybody they considered as their opponents, and used fear tactics under the influence of the most fanatical viewpoints and superstitions. They demanded submission under the sword, and engaged in bloodbaths everywhere they went, having no respect for human dignity just the same as a few other nations. Many European innocents have been slaughtered by them. It is no wonder that Europeans were wary of their expansion. However, European forces succeeded in defending the city of Vienna during a Turkish attack in 1529, and their fleets defeated the Turkish navy in the Battle of Lepanto near Greece in 1571. In 1683, the Turks again tried to capture Vienna, but failed. During the 1700s, the Ottomans became weaker and lost a 6-year battle against Russia. They were unable to stop the Russian navy passing through Turkish-occupied waters, losing the Crimea Peninsula in the Black Sea to Russia in 1783. During the 1800s, the Ottomans lost most of their territories. Greeks and Ottoman Turks were certainly not on good terms, and in fact, Greek nationalists rebelled against the Ottomans. Great Britain, France, and Russia sided with the Greeks, and the Treaty of Adrianople, which is currently known as Edirne, ended the fighting in 1878, acknowledging the independence of the Danube. After losing the Balkan territories, the Ottoman Empire continued to decline. They lost Algeria to France in 1830, and France seized Tunisia in 1881. Britain did the same with Cyprus in 1878 and Egypt in 1882. After this, the Ottomans ardently tried to reorganize their military. Sultan Abdülhamid II came to the throne, ruling as a dictator. His policies were violent and used excessive fear tactics. Religious persecution spread throughout the country. During the late 1800s, a small group of Turkish students and military officers rebelled, opposing Hamid's policies. Although the Sultan staged a counter-revolution, the Young Turks succeeded in removing him, and for a while his brother Muhammad V was made the new ruler in 1909. Unfortunately, many minorities suffered greatly at the hands of their cruel masters. Many public beheadings of infidels became the norm. They forced the families and even the children of those not belonging to their religious ideals into submission and undignified situations at every level. They were completely against every new way of thinking and all conceivable advancements one could imagine. Progressive thinking was not allowed, and women were not valued. In fact, many newborn female babies were buried alive. Christian minorities, such as the Armenians, demanded freedom from Ottoman rule. The empire continued to decline. Soon after the revolution, in 1908, Bulgaria became independent. Austria claimed Bosnia, and in 1912, Italy took Libya. In 1913, Greece took Cyprus, and by 1914, the empire lost all its European territories except Thrace. It was about this time in history my father was born, in 1911, and mother in 1914. They certainly had some interesting stories to tell. The Ottoman Empire entered World War I during that year. They sided with Germany and Austria-Hungary in an attempt to regain all their lost territory. Although their forces appeared to succeed, the British, French, and other Allied forces fought to gain control of the Straits in order to assist Russia. Despite all that, Turkey was able to drive back the invaders, yet they ended up with a crushing defeat, and the Allies won the war in 1918. Allied troops, occupying Istanbul, and the Straits. During May 1919, Greek troops landed in the Turkish port of Izmir to provide protection for the Allied forces. The Greeks then began to advance further into the country, and the Turkish populace became more resentful against the inability of their Ottoman rule to defend their country. Alas, there were many other reasons for Turks to protest against Ottoman rule. Education, particularly the education of girls, was not emphasized. Yet one discovers that in ancient days, science and education was regarded as important by those adhering to the religious identity of the Ottomans. Under strict Islamic rule, Ottoman sultans progressively did not become brilliant leaders, this allowing creative thinking. During those pre-revolutionary days, art of any kind was deemed to be against principles laid down by Allah, and anyone practicing such acts of an allegedly satanic nature was punished severely. Song and dance was not approved of, nor was painting people's portraits. That was considered as idol worship, which their religion forbade. Only religious art of Quran-based calligraphy and ornamentation was permitted, although some of the great Ottoman conquerors' images had previously been painted by European artists of renown. When the very first light bulb was introduced and installed in the Sultan's palace, it had to be removed immediately, for it apparently glowed with the mocking grin of the devil. Many Judaic laws were Islamized and practiced under the guise of their religious identity, with additional rules, including dictation on men and women's dress codes and what they ate and drank. Some of those rules in regard to ancient hygiene and behavioral patterns were appropriate. For example, the eating of pork after unhygienic storage, or consuming wine after the practice of crushing grapes under people's dirty feet. However, those rules and regulations were over the border, as with many other practices, and were punishable by death. It was then that Mustafa Kemal, a Turkish military hero born in Thessalonica, organized a nationalist movement. Under his leadership, a nationalist congress met in Sivas in September to form a government. In April 1920, the Congress organized the Turkish Grand National Assembly in Ankara. They elected Kemal as the assembly president, but the Sultan's government signed the Treaty of Sivas with the Allies in August 1920. Under that treaty, Turkey was reduced to just the city of Istanbul, and the Sultan's popularity declined. In September 1922, nationalist forces drove the Greek troops out. The Grand National Assembly abolished the office of Sultan, and the Allies agreed to draw up another peace treaty with the nationalists. The Treaty of Lausanne was signed in 1923 and set the borders of the country as they are today. My parents have certainly experienced interesting and exciting times, but they were not the good old days. They were troubling times. In that confusion, they had to hide themselves when in Turkey and blend in with the locals of that country. No matter what innovations in thought and political expressions were present at the time, the old mentality amongst the Turks was still alive. Have they changed today? One would ideally wish they have, but unfortunately, the ingrained mentality still remains. Religious fanaticism rules supreme. The Grand National Assembly proclaimed Turkey a republic on October 29, 1923, and elected Kemal as their president. During the 1920s, and 1930s, they underwent major social changes, doing away with certain Islamic traditions, such as the Arabic alphabet, the Islamic legal system, Muslim schools, madrasas, and the wearing of Islamic clothing by both men and women. They abolished the civil and religious office of the caliph and outlawed polygamy, they having more than one wife, and therefore harems. Women were given the right to hold positions and vote. None of these changes were previously available under strict Islamic law. Now citizens had the right to practice any belief system, although the country is known to be officially Islamic. However, the radicalism of old remains even today, although many Turks prefer to deny it. There are many Armenians amongst other minority groups whose rights are restricted, although as a survival strategy they had to change their identities and names, thereby achieving acceptance. When and if their parental backgrounds are questioned, the consequences can be catastrophic. Strangely, if anyone is unfortunate enough to have to declare the unacceptable or infidel names of his or her parents, that person is forced to feel embarrassed for having a so-called criminal background. Worse still, one may be completely shunned or constantly under surveillance. However, history shows that some Turks preferred the traditional system and opposed Mustafa Kemal, known as Atatürk, the father of Turks. He was the first Turkish president serving until his death in 1938. İsmet İnönü became the next president, and under him Turkey evaded entering the Second World War. This is also when they joined the United Nations. After the war, Russia demanded the right to build military bases in the Straits and have control of the country's eastern territories. Turkey requested the Western powers' assistance. I was only 4 years old when U.S. President Truman announced the Truman Doctrine in 1947. This way, the United States was enabled to provide assistance to any country threatened by outside forces, and in return, the United States would build military bases on Turkish soil. Atatürk founded the Republican People's Party, which governed Turkey since its establishment until 1950, when the Democrat Party won the majority in the Grand National Assembly. Celal Bayar became president, and Adnan Menderes was appointed prime minister. By the late 1950s, national debt was on the increase, and there were restrictions on freedom of speech. But one wonders if the system is any different today. The Democrat Party lost its popularity during the 1960s, and military forces considered the party becoming more and more distant from Atatürk's ideals. General Cemal Gürsel took control of the country, and the military placed a number of former leaders on trial. Prime Minister Menderes was publicly hanged, and President Bayar sentenced to life, but was later released. Although we have been told so many things in this regard, it all appeared biased. There were others who denied all the information provided and claimed that Mr. Menderes was selling Turkey to Americans, and this was allegedly the real reason for what happened to him. Busloads of school children were encouraged to pay their respect by visiting the hanging traitor and read the judgment paper attached to his chest. Unfortunately, it was an ugly experience to witness. I remember the empty streets normally bustling with activity, when I took a stroll, observing soldiers with their guns and army tanks rolling along the streets. This was during one of the school holidays. It was eerie and frightening, just like in the movies, except it was happening in real life. The feeling was that someone could be shot, and it could be me. One soldier approached me and said, "But you're going home, aren't you?" I answered him with a definite yes and continued walking. I wanted to see one of my school friends. I just cannot forget that time of unrest when in Ankara. Turkey's current constitution was adopted in 1961. Members of the Republican People's Party were chosen for the highest office. İsmet İnönü became prime minister and Gürsel became president. In 1965, the Justice Party won the majority in the government, and its leader Süleyman Demirci became prime minister. Gürsel continued in his post until 1966. But I had already left the country for good in 1963. I will tell you more about that issue a little later. Although Atatürk revolutionized Turkey and brought wonderful changes culturally, such as freedom of speech and expression, yet throughout the years some people still prefer the pre-Atatürk days, still fantasizing about totally Islamizing Turkish society, its education system, and the army. They seem to be succeeding. Let us not forget that there are political parties which prefer to return back to the days when they used the Arabic alphabet while also applying Islamic rules to their everyday lives. Perhaps harems will become available once again when a Turkish caliphate is established or an Ayatollah regime is introduced, and who can guess that perhaps women will lose all their human rights. Would modern Turks allow it? Long before their partial sojourn in Anatolia, believing they may be able to claim their once-upon-a-time real estate, my father, together with his other relatives, preferred to stay in Istanbul, owing vast amounts of money due to his gambling. It seemed he was involved in other activities, which may not have been very ethical or desirable. On the other hand, my mother, with her background, was a very determined person who studied hard for a beneficial career in dress design, including creations for Christian Dior in Paris. She excelled in her skills and had her own salon, employing many others. While in Turkey, after traveling from the city of Yozgat to Ankara, some other relatives imagined that she and my father, despite being cousins, could help each other if they lived together, thereby helping one's relatives, which they believed was the appropriate thing to do. Obviously, they did not know or want to know the actual circumstances. I felt that it was more or less to help the miserable young man with his dilemmas. After all, my mother was generating a good income. After negotiations and many wonderful promises, they got married. Things apparently looked really brilliant. However, it seemed that my father had a different agenda. For instance, by making use of his wife's wealth, he could become free from his debts. She has indeed paid vast amounts towards what he owed, as well as his habit of betting on the horses. He was more passionate about horse racing than anything else. He was not interested in having a family to love and cherish. His marriage was not based upon love, nor did he have any desire for it. My father did not know what true love was, and he was, as far as I could see, totally devoid of it. It seemed that the military was the only thing he cared for, even in a commanding post. But if this was true, in a country where he endured hardships, being treated as if he was nobody due to his origins, he had no chance to progress. It was obvious that he had lived without his parents most of his life, and did not know what parental care and love was. He grew up in a loveless society, in a loveless home, and the war years took their toll. 8 years before my birth, in 1943, my mother's sister had a reasonably happy marriage, and 2 sons, whom my mother adored. I think that it was due to becoming their caregiver and surrogate mother, feeding them with her own breast milk. Apparently, my aunt could not feed them, and her husband had been murdered by a group of hooligans after his work on completion of an important electrical job. His life ended due to evil intent, jealousies, and racially motivated hatred, and when his body was discovered, his head had been stabbed many times by those criminals, using his tools and screwdrivers. No one was punished by their law for killing an Armenian dog. I suppose my mother felt the need to take responsibility and care for them, partially to assist her sister Perlanti. I feel by now that you would like to ask me where those names you read and perhaps find hard to pronounce come from. As mentioned before, they are ancient names originating in Sanskrit, Norwegian, Greek, and Armenian. You may also find them in India and in South Americas, as I did during my adult years. It can give you some clues about my origins. According to my father, he initially did not want to be married, but was apparently forced into it. He did not want to have a family and children, unless he could treat them like some men from patriarchal backgrounds, as it was throughout the Middle East, or Europe of the Middle Ages. Then again, probably he did not know anything about how to be a father, or did not desire to be responsible for important finances, which were deemed necessary for the welfare and education of his children. He wanted to have a life of ease, for reasons known only to him. My mother was the only one who provided food, clothing, and did all sorts of things through her profession for the upkeep of the home, while my father occupied himself as a watchmaker for the Swiss Zenith Watch Company after his army days. His earnings were spent on horses, other gambling habits. I believe his upbringing had a lot to do with his character. Domineering like Muslim tribesmen, just looking after his own interests, but he was neither religious nor had anything to do with the Muslim faith. According to what my mother clearly explained, he was intent to bring home gigolos to her with plenty of money. In other words, he wanted her to become his whore, thus making lots of money in his imaginations. He was very upset and extremely angry with her for not accepting his generous offer. He obviously felt his plans were being ruined. He bitterly hated his own parents and my mother's mother. I believe it was due to them forcing him to marry. In all honesty, I could not understand the reasons behind this situation, and my mother avoiding talking about the issue. Over time he threatened my mother, shouting that he had spent his sperms, and he could take them away by killing the child born into his unwanted family. He reasoned that he could easily take it away, because he was the father, and nobody could ever stop him. This trend got worse as time went by, Sometimes he did not come home at night, and on arrival in the morning he slept long hours in his own quarters, later waking up to hurt his wife with his physical and verbal abuses yet again. On the other hand, my mother took it as being her destiny, praying that things would get better. During their reasonably calmer days, they visited some of his friends, even at one stage going to a photographic studio to have family photos taken, as was customary in those days. I remember how my mother once held me behind the heavy velvet curtain in the studio. They took an infant picture of me naked, my mother proudly displaying the enlarged, hand-colored photograph of me on the wall. When a little over 2 years old, I used to ask her why she chose to live with this terrible person, making her wonder how it was possible for a toddler to ask such a question. 2 years later, on the 13th of March, 1945, my brother Haritune was born. He was the other one to follow me. Happy times were very rare and far between. However, on a lighter side of things, on one of those occasions, some parents used to dress their sons like girls, or vice versa, just for fun, during photographic sessions. I remember when our mother and aunt took us to a local studio where my brother was dressed like a girl. It probably provided light-hearted conversation amongst friends. We were inseparable as brothers, playing happily together, eating, sleeping, and enjoying the outdoors. Sometimes we were a little noisy, but as long as we did not see our father, or he was not around, the happier we were. However, at birth my brother had to have an immediate medical procedure to separate his penis from inside his testes. My mother was so immensely happy about a Dr. Kamil Sokullu, who performed the delicate surgery, and often talked about what a brilliant doctor he was. My father did not contribute anything towards the cost, and did not care. He would not care even if we were family dogs. This is said in all honesty, for it is factual. My parents' relationship worsened with every passing day, and there were so many things I could not understand. For example, where I was allegedly born was never clearly explained. The only explanation was that I was born. A few other lies have also been told to us children, including how a stork had dropped us in front of our parents' front door in Ankara. This seems to be a classic story told to children all around the world. At other times, I was even told that I was born in flight. Was I born on a plane, traveling somewhere in Europe, or perhaps while going to Turkey? How unusual it was to be treated as if I was a member of the alleged Armenian dogs there, and forced into feeling embarrassed all the time for belonging to that race throughout my childhood, during my forced stay in that country, which in reality was no home to me. Another enigma was that my father preferred me to be registered as being born somewhere in Turkey, because they once had properties there. I often asked, but got no true answers from anybody. I believe he was dreaming about something impossible to regain. It did not make any sense because, in the first place, I was the unwanted child, as far as he was concerned. Probably his friends or other relatives convinced him that he could benefit from this and should think twice before getting rid of me. This enigma has remained in my mind up until now, whenever I think about their heated debates during so-called family gatherings. But many things were still completely hidden from us. For example, they always avoided talking about our grandparents' unusual tattoos. On their wrists and arms were numbers, and on their upper arms the word Jude, and a star, which we were to learn symbolized the Star of David. That word and the emblem were most certainly Jewish, and also grants words such as, "My sweet love, there was too much suffering, and it is better we do not speak anything more of it for now," were quite a concern. Obviously, her and the other elderly relatives' pasts were painful memories. Possibly they had escaped from it all and ended up in Istanbul, seeking refuge. What was the actual reality? Were their origins in other parts of the Middle East? However, it still did not explain the mystery surrounding my birth. It came closer to my parental origins, which they preferred not to dwell on. I remembered so many stories being told to us that a large number of Jews came from the European continent, particularly Spain and Russia, to dwell in Istanbul. The research I conducted into my ancestral origins did not provide absolute answers, but only fragments, as most of the documentation had been destroyed throughout the decades. Yet what I have been able to discover, like an enigma, still provided me with a few clues to follow. Was this the same with my grandparents? My subsequent research revealed so little that I could not even begin to make any sense of it. The only reasonable substantial discovery about some of my distant relatives and both sets of my grandparents was their close links with India, the city of Gujarat, and also that of Jerusalem. My mother used to talk very happily about her father and even her grandfather being very generous and helpful individuals to others, owning oil fields somewhere beyond Baghdad. Was she joking? She told me how similar I looked to my grandfather, whom I had never met. He either died of natural causes or was killed. I had no idea about their history, even after making several inquiries about them. Although my mother told me very little, my research took me back to France, to Provence. Grandfather was apparently extreme with his hygiene, just like me. Everything about my Earthian background has become like a jigsaw puzzle. My understanding was that the majority of their important papers had disappeared or were deliberately destroyed to avoid further persecution. This made me feel like someone dumped in the middle of a desert. I kept asking about who, where, and when I was, to no avail. I felt like a young man without a background. My father used to repeatedly recite his own mother's words, saying, "If there was a God, why did he abandon what was his?" He became an atheist and never spoke much about anything. But in reality, and without any prejudice, I feel like repeating my words. He was never a good father. This is really a very hard statement to make. However, when he was asked to register his firstborn son, according to a perceived tradition, he apparently wanted only to do so in Istanbul, and chose a suburb therein, Taksim, Beyoğlu, Işıklar Sokak. Although knowing in absolute certainty that I was not born anywhere near there. We have been unreliably informed that he was either stationed there or lived in that part of the country working on behalf of some authority which we were never to discover about. The reasons for this I can only guess, but cannot be absolutely certain about. It was either a safe refuge to start everything anew without a definite background, or simply wanting to forget and leave an unfortunate past behind. This could primarily enable his own self to become wealthy after reclaiming what he dreamt of. With his Indo-European origins, we were told that he was just like his grandparents, having a military background and a highly responsible post. Let us remember that the Armenian language is known as being Indo-European, and not all Armenians are of an Orthodox background. There are those who practice the Jewish traditions. One of our other relatives had allegedly made his way to Germany, living like all other Germans, and entering the ranks of the Reich, serving his Führer in a commanding post. I'm unsure about the reality of this issue, as many stories we are told, and there were also those others we have never been enlightened about. If true, his story can be found by whoever intently studies Germany's colorful history. Since it was requested by my now-deceased mother and other relatives, I shall not include further information. However, I am still none the wiser about my father's real background. Concerning my mother, we have been informed that her distant past was related to some nobility. Some of her distant relatives also lived in Greece, and were somewhat connected with the throne of a great European nation. My grandmother made mention of this several times to both my brother and me. Whenever there was any inquiry about it, there followed a strict criticism about her probably having lost all sense of reality. Therefore, we should simply ignore it, or there was a total silence on their part. Nothing more spoken about it. There were times when our mother advised us never to make any mention of this, as it was so desired by the decree of an important authority. Who or what that authority was, we never questioned. We have never been told anything about what the national identity of that office was. How much of it was real, I have not been enlightened. No matter what research was conducted on my part, it all ended as if I was hitting my head against brick walls. If the whole story had no significance, why was there any mention of it in the first place? Other relatives painting my grandmother's mental state was puzzling, as she lived in isolation with her bachelor son. She never made a sound, and nobody knew if she existed at all. But my mother's noble and extremely dignified personality and etiquette spoke volumes. She was highly respected by everybody and the girls she employed. They learned many things from her. She taught them not only the art of dressmaking, exquisite designs, but also proper etiquette. Those my mother employed also used to do occasional home duties and cooking. Admittedly, their cooking was better than my mother's at times, but I chose not to speak of it out of respect to her. However, certain aspects of my mother were puzzling. For example, although reasonably well-educated, she would still take the advice of a few old people about a quick-fix treatment for health issues with us boys. I cannot forget how she obtained my brother's urine on their advice and mixed it with an amount of apricot compote, offering it to me to eat to cure my jaundice. But when she finally took me to the doctor, explaining the wise advice of one of her old friends to feed me with my brother's urine, the doctor was utterly shocked, advising her to cease her unforgivable treatment of the boy, while drawing her attention to my jaundiced looks, the yellow coloring visible all over my body, including my eyes. I remember how worried my mother was, but with the proper treatment and medication, I was soon well again. The doctor then advised her that the child would not be able to give blood to anybody when he was grown up. I'm still amazed about this naive attitude of my mother. Certainly, another lesson was learned. My mother had a hobby, looking into coffee cups for what some people would classify as psychic reading. Yet she did not take it seriously. It was, after all, one of the traditional pastimes many other locals were engaged in. Interestingly, when she read those cups, she was extremely accurate. Some of her friends jokingly called her a good witch, and sometimes even a white witch. I cannot say whether it was due to her being highly intelligent or due to her appearance, but she was not a real witch. Contrary to personal judgments of a few people I thought were my friends, but who proved themselves otherwise, speaking completely against her due to their superstitious beliefs. We will talk about them soon on As Is basis, for they stole a major portion of my youth. Going back, I remember asking my mother over and over again why she had to marry this man I did not desire to call Dad. It hurts me to say that he was a man who behaved like a criminal, even a murderer, with all his tendencies. I will repeat myself once again, for I often asked her why she needed to suffer and be beaten up most of the time, for it did not make any sense. Why, Mom? Why not leave him today? I knew she was extremely frightened of him, and yet her answer to my question was often hesitant, saying that she did not want us to grow up without a father. Deep inside, she suffered in silence for a very long time. However, we boys were growing up without a father anyway. Quite frankly, we were growing up in utter fear and sadness. My brother and I often asked each other, was he perhaps going to kill us sometime soon? In fact, he often threatened to do so. I believe that my mother took that simply as a form of speech, but did not believe he actually would. We could not trust our father under any circumstances. At one stage, just out of the blue, he had a pair of my mother's sharpest dressmaking scissors in his hands, she telling us to run and go to the police, while the mad idiot, swinging the scissors at her, started to chase us, shouting he was going to kill his young sons, the dirt of the earth. We ran through the deserted streets in the early hours of the morning, absolutely frightened, but fast. We were faster than him. Eventually, out of breath, he must have collapsed, or was arrested. We had no idea. Then we went to my aunt's place, and she, leaving us there, went to see our mother along with her two sons. Our father was with his ever-faithful lady friend, Fatima, at that time, and did not return home for several days. My brother and I wished he would never come home, and we were crying our eyes out. Alas, he returned, and hissing, as per his habit when angry, did not utter a word for days. This trend was always evident and became more frequent from then on. Our cousins somehow made him calm down by offering him strong hallucinogens, ouzo and playing card games in the local coffee shop and pub. Only then would he calm down for a short while until the next episode of uncontrolled anger. We were, in fact, putting up with his psychological traumas. I believe he suffered a form of narcissism or some other form of trauma from his war years experiences. My mother used to stay up in case he would violently attack us during the night.